Greetings, ladies and gentlemen of YouTube. I'm Cipher, and this is the Devil's Advocate Debate Club. Welcome back. Today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about Elizabeth Warren's wealth tax. I recently mentioned on Twitter that it could potentially leave me homeless in a very short period of time, despite the fact that I would not be paying any of it. But this, as I've looked deeper into it, appears not to be the case. We'll get into the details in a minute. However, the tax plan is much more devious and just almost evil than I could have imagined. Let's get into the details. What exactly is a wealth tax? Well, the tax that most people are most familiar with would be probably an income tax. That's where you're taxed based off the amount of money you make. A wealth tax, on the other hand, calculates your net worth, so all properties you own, investments you've made, basically everything that is, your financial stability, and then taxes you off of that. Now, initially I thought that this would have an impact on my landlord, as he is a millionaire with his net worth of properties combined. It looks, at least initially, like the plan is only supposed to affect people who make $50 million or more, though it's unclear whether those are all that the plan will affect, or those are all that we have the numbers published for so far. And regardless, a plan like this could certainly be expanded on to, say, affect everyone who is a millionaire. Were that the case, my initial fears could become a rapid reality. But regardless, let's talk about this nightmare as it currently exists. Just give you just a little bit of a background on Elizabeth Warren. I'm sure most of you know who she is. However, for anyone who hasn't been paying attention, she is the modern day equivalent of the boy who cried wolf. She has made a career out of just large-scale lies to forward herself and her career and popularity, and to the point that if she were ever to tell the truth on something major, I think a lot of people would probably immediately dismiss it because, well, she's lied so much it's almost just to be expected when she opens her mouth. Now, personally speaking, I try very hard not to fall into the boy who cried wolf fallacy and try to give everything a logical look, no matter how many times a person has lied to me in the past. Looking at this wealth tax, it is a terrible, terrible idea. The reason being that many, many people would be taxed more than they could reasonably pay. Take, for example, Jeff Bezos. Now, I was playing around with Elizabeth Warren's wealth calculator, the Billionaire Tax Calculator, which at first I laughed. I thought it was funny, that was maybe just meant to be a meme, but it does in fact have, for the most part, real numbers in it. And if you click that you're not a billionaire, it just gives you a list of billionaires to click on. If you actually say you're a billionaire and type in a net worth of over $1 billion, it'll tell you how much you would be taxed. However, when it says click on one of these billionaires to see how much they're taxed, if you do, it gives you their net worth and tells you not to worry about them for a series of reasons without actually telling you how much they'll be paying in taxes. This is incredibly disingenuous. Going beyond that, though, and taking Jeff Bezos as an example, just because, well, he was one of the first ones on the list, and I've heard people talking about him a lot recently. Jeff Bezos has investments in different companies of over $100 billion. If you put his net worth into the wealth calculator, it'll tell you that he would pay about $6.69 billion in taxes every year. Now, the problem with that is Jeff Bezos's earnable income is actually less than $1 million a year. I forget exactly how much it is, but Jeff Bezos doesn't have $6 billion in income to pay. In fact, he doesn't have anywhere near that. He would have to start liquidating assets, selling some of those investments, companies, and whatever off in order to even just remotely come close to paying taxes, and then would have to sell more in order to continue to surviving, as his entire salary many times over would have to be given up. Here's the big problem with that. I mean, the concept of redistribution of wealth isn't something I'm a particular fan of, but I will say that in certain cases there are pros and cons to it. In this case, though, I only see cons, and here's why. Someone like Jeff Bezos, or any of the other billionaires on the list, really, if they're going to be selling major assets, are going to have to sell them to someone to make this money. They're probably going to have to do it quite rapidly. Now, there are in many cases going to be company bylaws and potentially even actual national and international laws that stop you from selling companies too fast or at a certain profit, meaning that it may very well be literally impossible and illegal for some of these billionaires to liquidate enough of their assets in order to pay Elizabeth Warren's tax plan. It really seems to just be a plan to have an excuse to jail or bankrupt billionaires, which, if you're one of the people who believes that it's just morally wrong to have more than $1 million in wealth or more than $1 billion in wealth, that might sound great. But I'm afraid you're also a huge minority in this country, and that to the rest of us, that sounds absolutely nightmarish. However, let's assume for just a moment that one of these billionaires, or all of these billionaires, are in fact able to sell enough of their assets to pay this ridiculous tax. Well, they're going to have to sell these assets to somebody. And they only have a few options because, I mean, if you're trying to sell to other billionaires in America, they're all facing the same problem and are going to be liquidating assets, looking to sell, not buy. This will leave you with, in my opinion, and from what research I've done, 3 options for liquidating these assets. You can either A, sell to big corporations who, because they're conglomerates and, hide money overseas, or are made up of groups of board members rather than individuals hiding the wealth among them. So you could start re-corporatizing individual money, taking people like, Bezos is already very corporate, it's all investments. But someone like Zuckerberg, who is corporate now, but who basically just started a company from the ground up, you would be forcing him to sell a lot of his wealth to other big companies. In fact, some of the only companies that are going to be able to start affording to make these purchases are going to be oil companies and other just big industries. The war industry, the arms production industry is probably rich enough that they'd be purchasing some of these assets. Anyway, though, so option 1 is to sell it to big corporations. Option 2 would be to, if you can, sell to the government, finding reasons to, sell back land to the BLM or one thing or another. I don't really know how much of an option this would be for most billionaires, but there would be cases where some liquidatable assets would be able to be sold to the government. The third option, and really the most realistic one as it ties into the first corporate option, is to sell to overseas billionaires. It would be to sell American assets. A lot of the people on the list, if we look at 50 million and up, not the billionaires, who would be most affected by this would be landlords. And the assets they would be liquidating would be properties, which for the most part they wouldn't be able to sell to other Americans at prices that they would actually be able to pay their taxes on. See, they can't cut prices on the properties to sell them to the low-income people who might need housing. In fact, they'd likely have to jack up the prices and sell to overseas investors in order to pay off a tax that requires them to pay hundreds of times more than the amount that they make in a year. And no, in many of the cases of these billionaires, I'm not kidding, hundreds of times more than their income a year. So, ultimately speaking, a lot of the assets being sold would end up in the hands of, foreign interests. Foreign interests from all over the world would get footholds in America, but only the rich ones, mostly corporate, maybe a few, Saudi princes and the like, and they would probably start investing in America because, we're a great land of wealth, and if they were living outside of our country, not having to pay the wealth tax, but able to collect wealth in America to a degree, well, that causes all kinds of problems. And if they are required to pay the wealth tax, if overseas interests can't find a way to skip around it, and if it were expanded to include corporations and not just individuals, then this just means it's going to be a constant seller's market, and eventually everyone at the top is going to be bankrupt, with the properties and everything like it in the hands of the major corporations who manage to survive. This is a type of fascist wealth redistribution. Instead of taking wealth from the wealthy and giving it to the poor, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be forcing the wealthy to sell their assets to the extremely corporately wealthy. I mean, Jeff Bezos has over $100 billion in net assets, but that's nothing compared to Alphabet or Google or some of the other companies, many of which are, like Google, based largely in other countries. So, the wealth tax, just in general, is a bad idea, or at least at the percentage that Warren has stated. It would lead to a redistribution of wealth into the wrong hands, and if it is extended to affect people who have a net worth of $1 million or more, so rather than 50 million or more, at that point it would affect my landlord, who, in order to pay the tax, if the percentages, even if they went down, were anywhere similar, would have to sell, actually, not the properties that he rents out to other people. The only one that would be a net sale enough to pay these taxes, or come close to paying them, would be the property where he lives. Where I also live, because I rent out a cottage on the backside of the property. This means that my landlord, were this wealth tax to apply to him, would have to sell his biggest assets, move into a smaller home, and would then no longer have the rental capacity to, well, keep himself going in life. And this has been his retirement option. He put his retirement savings into investing in properties and makes money off of the rentals rather than the stock market. That way, if there's a stock market collapse, the land is still stable. This would probably bankrupt him. It would force a man reaching his 70s to go back into the workforce in order to provide for himself and his family, and it would most likely leave me on the streets, as I've honestly got a pretty good deal here and I'm struggling to keep it up as it is because I'm just not financially stable at the moment. And if a corporate interest, which is who he'd likely have to be selling to, bought the land, they're probably either going to do something else with it entirely, or at the very least raise rent to levels that I wouldn't be able to afford. This would leave both my landlord and I likely, well, okay, I would be homeless and he would be in a smaller house struggling to feed himself. That's what Elizabeth Warren's wealth plan looks like. And I'm not wealthy. It affects anyone who is in any way connected to someone wealthy. If your landlord has properties of more than $1 million, if you live somewhere in an apartment building or wherever with a landlord with more than $1 million and it were to $1 million, that would affect you. But really, a lot of the people that have lots of properties, say, investors who have multiple apartment complexes and such, are going to be in that $50 million range, where they might only bring in $100,000 or less a year for their own actual income off of all of these properties after maintenance and other things are considered, but have holdings of more than $50 million. That means that people who are in low-income apartment complexes, for instance, are one of the groups that would be most likely to be negatively affected by this tax other than the rich. So it's going to be bad for the rich in America. It's going to be bad for the poor in America. It probably won't have much of an effect in the middle class in America, and it's going to allow corporate foreign interests to basically get whatever foothold they want in our country by buying rapidly liquidated assets that would be being liquidated across the board were this plan to be implemented. It is insane. It is mathematically unrealistic. And it affects everyone from 50 million up. But the wealth tax calculator only shows how much you'd be paying from $1 billion and up. The reason I think for this is that 50 million to $1 billion is a big difference, and the vast majority of people who would be affected by this tax, the vast majority of people who would, have to pay probably more than what they make in a year and wouldn't be able to survive, aren't going to be able to use this wealth calculator because they're not billionaires. So Elizabeth Warren has made this easier on the ultra wealthy, while harder on the moderately wealthy who it would also affect. It's disingenuous, it's evil, it does nothing but serve corporate and probably corporate overseas interests, and if anyone can come up with any reason to me why fascist wealth redistribution into the hands of big corporations is a good idea, well, I'll be very, very surprised, because I was discussing with my roommate the other day the concept of anarchy, because I got into an argument with someone online about anarchy and anarcho-communism, long story short. And he was saying that any form of government would be better than pure anarchy. I mean, not anarcho-communism, but real anarchy. That any system would, provide more safety than true anarchy. And I've been playing devil's advocate a lot, so I sat and thought about it and tried to come up with a system that was worse than anarchy. What I came up with was the idea of I guess it would basically be a fascist libertarian system where corporate interests were protected, not just above individual interests, but individual interests were not protected at all. So anarchy on the individual level with corporate interests protected, or or anarchic fascism, I suppose. It was literally the worst system of government that I could come up with. Something worse than absolute anarchy, because at least then you could protect your own interests without the, ultra corporate elite coming in and deciding what you could and could not do. And that's where Elizabeth Warren's tax plan will lead to a, right now, fictional potential system of government which is actually worse than anarchy. This tax plan, once I looked into the details, is the worst idea I think I've ever seen politically. I would rather vote for the Green New Deal, which is literally impossible. But that's just my opinion. I think I've ranted on this subject enough. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I'm desperately trying to figure out a way to set up a laptop with my account on it so that I'll actually be able to debate Nervardia. She is interested in she's interested in a regulated debate with me, and I've been looking for someone to debate for ages, just on any topic, and she's one of my favorite people on Twitter to disagree with, and just in general. So, I'll be working on that. Look forward to it. Don't forget to like and subscribe, but more importantly, just let me know what you think down below. I like talking to people. As always, I'm your host, Louis Cipher. Thanks for watching the Devil's Advocate Debate Club. Come on, Brood.